such a high proportion of people within the XRP community are just such good moral and ethical human beings. And 85% of people that are XRP holders were not vaccinated.
In regards to the survey, so I found 81% of those who are invested in XRP are unvaccinated. Now, that was a Twitter poll, but by comparison to regular polling is usually a sample size of 100. My sample size was about 18,000. Comes to what's called a Z-score in statistics. A Z-score of 143 is next to impossible. So that is what we're looking at here, is something that we could only say is an act of God, that this many quality people have found their way to the XRP ledger to be in this place and sustain the pressure of overwhelming force of Epstein and the governments and all of this coming down against XRP. We have been organized into a group of very select people that are in the right place. And I don't think it's by accident. I think it's because there is a reckoning coming in which XRP will naturally ascend to the number one cryptocurrency and quite a bit beyond that.
And we're back. Welcome to another week on the Cashu Podcast. This week, we have a very special guest once again, Mr. Patrick Riley. He is the CEO of Reaper Financial. He is a combat veteran. He featured on the XRP Unleashed documentary, which came out late 2024. He's minted specs for OverUnity devices on the XRPL, which I find fascinating. We're going to get into that. And he has recently gone viral on his X for his coverage of Bitcoin's embroilment inside the Epstein-files, validating a lot of the stuff that we've thought for a number of years. He's a contrarian thinker. He's added a lot of value to the XRP community over the years, and I'm pumped to have him on for a chat. So welcome, Patrick.
Oh, thank you, Nathan. And I don't think anyone's ever introduced me better than saying I'm a contrarian thinker. So appreciate that.
You're very welcome. Very welcome. Before we get into today's podcast, giveaway announcement. Month 2 of the giveaway inside my Patreon, we're giving away the limited edition RLUSD hat, 100% cotton corduroy, only made and sold for the Singapore Apex 2025. And I don't even know how many are left. There's probably less than 100 on Earth. So very, very unique and rare. That's going to be given away. And then we have 3 gold backs from different series: Oklahoma, Arizona, and Florida, the 2 gold back. I'm going to be giving away one of them for the new members only for Patreon, of which we've had like 50 come in the last 2 weeks. And then the other 2 will be going to existing members. And then, of course, you're all in the running for the RLUSD hat. Last month, we gave away 2 huge Tangent gift packs worth over 160 US each. And those will be happening every month, plus all the exclusive content that we have in there and a bunch of other good stuff, the chats, the private messages with me. Go check it out. All for less than a couple of cups of coffee per month. Well, we'll dive right in. And I know for the audience, they always love to get a bit of a look into the past and the genesis story of the guests. And you being no different, I'd love to hear how you got into this space and how that looks.
Yeah, so kind of, I don't know if you want the long or the short background, but
Go long, and we'll get into the juicy stuff after.
All right. Well, I come from kind of a rocky childhood and that kind of thing. But by the time I was 12, I was homeless till I was 17, joined the Army. In the Army, I became a combat medic. And in Iraq, 2009, I had a head injury, got blown up. And with that, I became what's called an acquired savant. So essentially, my head injury caused me to have neuroplasticity, or healing of the brain's scar tissue that created different neural pathways. And that kind of made me think a little bit differently than most people. So I'm what's called neurodivergent. And that has kind of set me on this path towards where we are. But while I was in the Army, and way back then is when I started inventing. And because I knew that with my inventions, I would never have the funding to bring them to light by traditional means of the stock market or, money markets or those types of things were never going to get me to where I needed to be. I, at that time, started looking at the finances of how I could get there. And I got into Bitcoin in about 2014. I sold my deployment baby GT500 to buy a few mining rigs in 2014. And, I was doing some cloud mining and hash flare and that kind of thing. And then by about 2017, I moved into the XRP ledger and that space really heavily as far as investment. And then came to 2021 when the vaccine mandates came out in the military here in the U.S. And I knew that I was getting out of the military. I'd done about half my life in it, but it was time. And so I started looking what I wanted to do when I got out, and crypto was kind of a passion for me, and it was where I saw the opportunities. So I launched Reaper Financial originally. And then over the last 4 years, we've launched an additional 6 companies, all related to the XRP ledger, and acquired one. And so it's been a fun journey, and we've got a long way to go in front of us, but we're definitely here to stay.
Beautiful. Just quickly going back to the neuroplasticity point, is that so? I've heard of a story before where someone got hit with a baseball bat, and a similar thing happened where they went from an ordinary sort of brain to that savantism, and they had photographic memory and a bunch of other things. What's the specific sort of skill or addition that you think you acquired?
So for me, it's more about systems. The way that I used to think, it was like I could, understand individual pieces of data really well, but I didn't necessarily connect them and I didn't necessarily see a larger picture. After my head injury, it was as if I only needed 20% of the pixels of any large image and my brain would automatically fill in the pieces between it. So I came back from Iraq. I started building cars from the frame up with no education or training in it. I just intrinsically understood the motors and everything that needed to be there. I was a combat medic, and I started to really intrinsically understand anatomy and physiology, just as if it was natural to me. And then when I started looking into finance, I kind of had the same journey. And so it's as if my brain just picks up on systems and it connects dots without me really having to try very hard at all. It's a very steep learning curve for me.
Interesting. That feeds into my next question, which is because you've got this propensity and gift now with connecting dots. Was there a moment at all that you can recall in your years of, say, research or painting these pictures that stands out in your mind as sort of a smoking gun moment with XRP?
Oh, well, it was definitely 2017, but as I really started to understand in regards to Bitcoin, it was more that there was fundamental flaws with the halving and with and not talking about the Epstein thing quite yet, but just the fundamentals of Bitcoin itself, the law of diminishing returns, the halving itself, which makes it so that it's going to be more expensive and a higher barrier of entry every 4 years for miners to come in. And that's going to consolidate those miners into first companies and now governments that are mining Bitcoin. But inevitably, that, of course, becomes a centralization scheme over time. So I started to really understand the flaws there and the flaws with Ethereum. And I got to XRP, and XRP had none of those flaws because of the Byzantine generals problem, because of the trustless system, consensus, 3 to 5 second transactions for under a penny. And I started to realize I could really do something with this that goes well beyond what was, possible with, Bitcoin or Ethereum. So to put that in perspective, right now I'm doing with just Ascension, we're doing about 1.2 million transactions per day, sending out various tokens to Ascension holders on the hour. So with that, Bitcoin can only get over about 600,000 transactions per day. So just our one token is outperforming Bitcoin by more than double in a day of its capacity. So XRP was very clearly the superior technology.
Interesting. I've heard you in an interview before. I think was with Ray Fuentes, where you mentioned a lot of the eureka moments as well for you were like, this technology has so many kind of crossovers when you referenced your knowledge with ancient currencies and ancient forms of money transfer. Like, could you elaborate on that a little bit more?
Yeah. So in modern times, and by modern, I mean the last 12,000 years, post deluge, in modern times, our earliest form of money that we have recorded is the Yap stone money. And I've actually been to the island of Yap in Federated States of Micronesia, and I've seen these, and they're basically very large limestone discs that would be transported about the island and traded and that kind of thing. And we moved from that was something very solid to, of course, some other cultures had a barter system. Some would have, things like dowries and marriage and things like that would be the transaction form. And we moved from that into precious metals because of the convenience and the solidity of those precious metals. We then moved from that down to coins and having a unit of account, and eventually to paper. And from paper, we would then have things like IOUs, checks, etc. But even as early as the 70s, we were starting to bring in the debit cards, and we were starting to bring in digital forms of cash. And inevitably, we got to Bitcoin and Ethereum and XRP. But the trend overall has been what makes it lighter, what makes it faster, what makes it easier, and what makes it less tangible. In every single step of finance throughout our modern history, we have gotten less tangible and more based on an idea. So when we talk about it from that sense, people want to brag about Bitcoin having miners and using, as much electricity as a small country. But that's a little bit ridiculous when you think about the trend of money. The trend of money is not towards difficulty or making things harder. It's towards allowing it to flow and having that velocity of money throughout the ecosystem.
That's a really good summarization. I like that. Now we'll switch gear because I'm sure a lot of the listeners will want to dive into this Epstein stuff. You've blown up on X the last couple of weeks. One, why do you think that is? And two, just explain what you have found / what has the Epstein-files validated in your already strong conviction in the broader narrative.
Yeah. So I'm not the average person out here on X who, is just finding out now about Epstein. And I know there's some anons out there, and there's some people that would call themselves awake that have been, kind of in the conspiracy game, I guess, for a few years and are aware of things. I'm not in that camp. I'm more in the camp of I've known these things for decades, and I've written reports to the Secretary of the Army of the United States as far back as 2021. When I did my objection to the COVID vaccine, I was already calling out the Bill Gates, Epstein, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and everything very factually in about a 450-page report that went to the Secretary of the Army, and they denied it, and that's fine. And I responded or appealed with one word, which was, fun, but that's another story. But my knowledge in the space of Epstein and the corruption comes from both my abilities to think very differently, but also my experience in the U.S. Army as a combat medic attached to psychological operations, civil affairs, working in first groups AOR all over Southeast Asia, in Palau, Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines, Malaysia. So I've got a lot of first world experience dealing with human trafficking, dealing with these things that people are just now starting to understand even exist.
Mm. And could you drill down a bit on it, just for the people that might not have the full context, exactly what has surfaced that you've pushed to the forefront of people's minds the last couple of weeks within those files, the actual specific links, Gensler was involved, like all these sorts of things?
Yeah, so we already knew Gary Gensler was very involved, and that was something I had put out a couple years ago. But Gary Gensler, who was coming out of the Goldman Sachs world for 20 some odd years, went into being the CTFC commissioner, who was part of the MF Global debacle, where he basically assisted a Democratic senator and later governor in defrauding a large number of people of about 1.7 billion. Due to some personal use of email, he intentionally flubbed that case and then went from that to being Hillary Clinton's CFO, where she knows all about those emails herself and how to do that same thing. He authored the check for the Steele dossier for $1 million to Christopher Steele to frame Trump for collusion with Russia and that type of thing. And then once they lost the election, he was job hunting. The emails from Epstein do confirm that he was job hunting through his connections with Clinton to Jeffrey Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein had his connection to Joichi Ito, who was the head of the MIT Media Lab. And Joichi Ito brought in Gary Gensler to teach a blockchain and cryptocurrency course at MIT before he was brought into the SEC as commissioner. But prior to that, we find that in 2014 and 2015, Jeffrey Epstein was coordinating with Austin Hill, and Austin Hill was Blockstream, which was one of the very first Bitcoin large-scale companies that was getting money from Andreessen Horowitz and getting money from all these large-scale investors. And Austin Hill didn't want the competition that was Ripple and Stellar. So he started complaining to Jeffrey Epstein, and Jeffrey Epstein, having already been fully invested in the Media Lab that was running the Bitcoin Foundation, basically the code commits or the oversight of what goes into the code of Bitcoin, which 75% of what is in Bitcoin's code has come after the Jeffrey Epstein influence came into the picture. So now with that, they essentially put Gary Gensler into a position where Gary Gensler could go after Ripple and through the SEC and influence the market to their favor to protect Bitcoin, to protect Ethereum with a free pass. And, of course, we've also seen the connection with Senator Elizabeth Warren, who was also a professor at Harvard. Epstein's connections all tie very deeply into the Stanford, Harvard, MIT, et cetera, on the boards and at the top levels of funding for these Ivy League schools. So what we've uncovered here is essentially a very deep influence campaign to protect Bitcoin and to prevent the rise of Ripple and XRP.
Yes, and that's how I read it. I think one of the interesting things to come out of this last couple of weeks is that there's a few important language choices in that email from Austin Hill around not having backers of two horses in the same race, which implies to me, and from our research, we obviously know that, Peter Thiel, a lot of the PayPal mafia, Andreessen Horowitz through A16Z, these were also venture funders of Ripple, OpenCoin.
Mm-hmm.
So the way I've read the last couple of weeks is that they'd spread themselves across, the whole pie without realizing the cannibalistic nature of their capital allocation at some point. And they've then had this moment of like, well, hang on, this isn't good and we need to pick a winner. Do you see it similarly?
Similarly, but I think in general, when you're an investor for, A16 and for the rest of these guys who were buying into both pots with Blockstream and Ripple, it makes perfect sense to diversify and buy the market. Essentially, that is the Warren Buffett strategy: is you buy the market, somebody's going to succeed, the rest are going to fail, and that's fine. That's how it goes. But what Austin Hill saw and what Jeffrey Epstein saw was that they had already achieved oversight and achieved control of Bitcoin. They hadn't achieved control of Ripple or Stellar, and they knew that those were the better technology. So they wanted to prevent Ripple from getting the financing from all the big players. And they wanted to ensure that Blockstream and Bitcoin and Ethereum were the ones getting the financing because they had positive control over those entities.
Yes. No, that makes sense. And this leads me to a philosophical question on the same subject matter. And it's something I talk a fair bit about, this idea that such a high proportion of people within the XRP community are just such good moraled and ethical human beings. And you had a post that I saw come up as well around this strange, well, not strange, it's only God ordained that, 85%, I think, of people that are XRP holders were not vaccinated. And you put that poll out a fair few years ago. It's statistically impossible for that to happen. And I firmly have believed for a while that it's statistically impossible for all of us, even today, with the markets bleeding so badly, to sit here with such conviction and calm and buy more. There has to be something special going on, one, but also the more specific question here for you is removing the people involved in Ripple, like the investors spreading their pot, etc. Do you think that Ripple are inherently the good guys and have always been the good guys all along?
So I'll answer the first question first. So in regards to the survey, yeah, so I found 81% of those who are invested in XRP are unvaccinated. Now, that was a Twitter poll, but by comparison to regular polling is usually a sample size of 100. My sample size was about 18,000. So my sample size of 18,000 coincided perfectly with Forbes and CNBC and other polling that had happened in 2021 in the height of the pandemic, that the XRP Ledger community was the highest vaccine skeptic community in cryptocurrency. There's also other studies out there that show we're the most intelligent. I think that's probably fair as well. I mean, you've seen some of these maxis and how they talk. But XRP Ledger, for us to have an 81% unvaccinated population by comparison to the general population, comes to what's called a Z-score in statistics, a Z-score of 143. 143 is not like the distance, that's the orders of magnitude from center. 0 would be a null Z-score where there's nothing there. If you have a Z-score over 2, generally that means there is a strong correlation. A Z-score of 143 is next to impossible. It's so far beyond entropy that it's actually as hard as breaking cryptography of SHA-256. So that is what we're looking at here is something that we could only say is an act of God, that this many quality people have found their way to the XRP Ledger to be in this place, to have overcome both the largest PSYOP in human history of COVID-19 and sustain the pressure of overwhelming force of Epstein and the governments and all of this coming down against XRP. And let's not forget that Epstein and Gates and the same crew has now been proven to be behind COVID-19. We have been organized into a group of very select people that are in the right place. And I don't think it's by accident. I think it's because there is a reckoning coming in which XRP will naturally ascend to the number one cryptocurrency and quite a bit beyond that. And I think the precipice is on us right now. Of course, we know that prices correlate between Bitcoin and XRP, and that's largely due to trading pairs across, thousands of exchanges. But Bitcoin has just broke its logarithmic scale of a 14, 15-year trend line, and it is probably not going to ever see itself come back above that trend line. In fact, if it does, it will probably take at least double that time of how long it took to get there, just in the way that charting and natural forces would work. So for it to dip back under 1,000 and then come back up is going to take 20 or 30 years for Bitcoin. And I think that's the precipice we're on right now. Is it's dying, and I know Bitcoin's been called dead 100,000 times, but it's really dying this time.
Interesting. So, do you think? Sorry, it was a long question, and it was a beautiful answer. Do you think Ripple are inherently the good guys?
So that one. So I'm a stickler on things like trust. Trust is when you know someone can harm you and can hurt you, and you give yourself the willingness to be blind to their ability to hurt you. So you're putting on blinders, essentially. I don't really do trust, and I don't really assume Ripple is the good or not good guys. What I will say is that regardless of whether they're the good guys or bad guys, the technology of XRP is still far superior to everything else. And there's a lot of us here for some reason. And I don't know that Ripple is going to come out of this looking perfectly clean. I honestly would be a little bit surprised if they did. But either way, I do think that XRP is the future of finance. And with that said, I think that the people who have been brought to hold XRP are here to make a better world in the future, regardless of what Ripple does or does not do, or whether they're clean or not clean.
Interesting. And back to that former point around Bitcoin. So you personally feel this is the final demise of Bitcoin?
I think that, if I could share a screen here, I can show you why
You should, go for it.
So crazy as Bitcoin is dying, but let me pull up a chart real quick. So let's see. This is
Should let you share down the bottom along the tab.
got it. All right, so here we see the classic coin market cap, and this is the regular Bitcoin chart. And if I turn off log, that's a scary drop, and we see that it's cut under a line that I was trying to zoom in there. It's cut under this very long trend line right here. If you were looking at the bottoms of Bitcoin over the last decade and a half, 15 years. And on a regular chart, you might think that that's coming back and that's going to recover. But on a logarithmic chart, when you zoom this out, we're looking at a complete collapse of its fundamentals from a charting perspective. It has the law of diminishing returns, which is you had your first halving and you had this run up in 2013. That was to around 1,000. And then 2017, we had the 20,000 mark. The next halving, it only got up to about 68 at the all-time high. And then this last halving, it only doubled. Now I know double your money in 4 years to some people in traditional finance might sound great, but in crypto, you know that there's a problem there if you're only going double in 4 years. And that's with the primary flagship asset of the asset class being Bitcoin. So we've now broken under the lifetime trend line of Bitcoin. And at a time where the Epstein-files, don't call me a conspiracy theorist here, but the Epstein-file release was so perfectly timed to Bitcoin breaking this trend line that you would almost think that they were intentionally aligned to happen at the same time.
Yeah, it does seem like that. it seems too coordinated. What I struggle with in real time is I think about this morning, I go, well, why does your Eric Trumps and all these people that have got these huge Bitcoin mining facilities that have poured clearly a lot of capital into setting themselves up on that path? Like, do they know that they're in a failing asset, or like what's with that? I don't understand.
Some of them do, but most of them are still risk off, even though they've got these multi-million-dollar mining facilities. That doesn't mean that they're actually dependent on that. That multi-million-dollar mining facility is an LLC wrapped in somebody else's money with an insurance backing and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They didn't use their own money. Eric Trump, I guarantee, did not spend $100 million out of pocket to build a mining facility. What he did is he said, I'm doing this WLFI thing, and we're going to raise money from all these other donors. And maybe 5 to 10% of that might be a mining facility somewhere. But if it fails, it doesn't matter because everything else is going to continue on anyway. There's very few mining companies out there that are wholly dependent on mining alone.
Yeah, that makes sense. Makes sense. And, it's probably a small portion of his total net worth anyway that's allocated to the cool Bitcoin project or whatever, or WLFI. Drilling down a little bit on this notion of ETH and Bitcoin free pass, just for some context to new listeners and new people to the community, because I know there's a lot of them that have come in the last year and a half in particular. You were on the XRP Unleashed documentary that was released back end of 2024, which really unwrapped and drilled into ETHgate. Right, when I think it was Bill Hinman slapped. Bill Hinman gave the free pass, if I'm not mistaken, to ETH and Bitcoin. Could you talk a bit more to that history and what happened with ETHgate and, Tether's embroilment, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, so although this is going to get a little bit convoluted, and I apologize for that, but it's only because there's so many angles to look at this from. So when Gary Gensler was meeting up with Perkins Coie and meeting up with these different entities, if you will, that were invested into Ethereum, what he was doing was he was allowing for them to have basically a free market within the United States, and that the primary thing there would be, and I wasn't really dug into XRP Unleashed, but I would say it was Wengseng company out of China. But even before that, you had Bill Hinman, which was a Trump appointee, and until the last day of his service, when he dropped the SEC lawsuit, he was also meeting up with Ethereum entities, and I forget now the name of all of them. He went over to serve on the board of an Ethereum entity after his term. But the free pass you mentioned is a term we use for a speech Bill Hinman gave, in which he basically spoke to the market with the SEC's approval. The ethics committee had all viewed his speech and whatnot. They recommended against it, but he still gave the speech in which he said that Ethereum is not a security, Bitcoin is not a security. And then he drove on as though nothing happened, left and went and joined a board of, I want to say it's Consensus. Don't quote me on that. It starts with a C. He went and joined the board of that, as well as A16Z and multiple other players, so that he could be a beneficiary of Ethereum's free pass. Then Gary Gensler gave a similar pass to Wengseng, which was a company out of China running about 300 different Ethereum companies underneath it. And all of those Chinese-based Ethereum companies were then free to play in the American market, while American companies were getting crushed.
Interesting. And if we switch it up a little bit now as we head towards this pinnacle point, how do you view the Clarity Act, for instance, and the back and forth going on right now in the Senate? Do you see it as instrumental in our next step forward, or does it not matter as much
It,
as
it
it's pumped up to be?
it's going to be a road bump. So the Genius Act, which was signed last year, and the Clarity Act are both basically speed bumps that get us towards meaningful regulation. And that is a good thing. But I will say, as it comes out, it's going to be rough around the edges. It's going to need some paving over, and it's going to need some follow-on things that will happen through litigation. They'll happen through additional bills and modifications to the bills, and that's still going to take some odd years. I will say that now that 401ks can be invested in cryptocurrency, now that we're seeing banks are able to custody cryptocurrency. All of these things are on the table for the players that are willing to take them, but there'll be something of a tipping point. And I would turn my head towards Robinhood in regards to that tipping point, because that's where the youth are interfacing with both the TradFi and the NewFi. But there'll be a point where we see a traditional style banking mix seamlessly with a NewFi cryptocurrency interface, and using all of the different tokens in different ways. And that tipping point is not very far away. It's probably 3 to 5 years out. It's just a matter of who gets there first. I have been talking to Charles Schwab and Fidelity about what they're working on. And I know that most of the big players, most of the big companies and banks don't yet grasp the opportunity that is right in front of them.
Interesting. So your time horizon's still a fair way. Do you see a lot of one of the stepping stones as well that gets talked a lot about is, for this transition to start to take place, there needs to be enough liquidity in the networks. Brad says it all the time. For them to flip the switch to ODL, there has to be enough liquidity. Do you see there being some sort of laddered approach where within the next little while, maybe year, there is this mass expansion to a point that then stagnates until we get the legislation smoothed over? We start to see the next phase. Have you mapped that out, or are you more removed and just agnostic to the way it all pans out?
No, I think what we're going to see is we've still got another 2.5 years of Trump left. And he's done many things over the last year that moved the market significantly. I'm not going to say manipulated the market, but let's say moved the market. Now, all it would take at this point is for him to be in an interview at the Oval Office and someone ask him about the decline of Bitcoin, and he says, yeah, I think it's dead. Or he could say something to the effect of, oh, I think some people say that's not the real Bitcoin. It's actually Bitcoin's Satoshi vision, or that's not Satoshi's original vision. If he said that, there would be a mass migration from Bitcoin to BSV almost instantly. So the same thing can happen for Ripple. And we, of course, know Brad Garlinghouse and Trump have been in the same room many times, and those meetings have been happening. And we know that there's a strategic crypto reserve, which is focusing on American companies, neither of which Bitcoin or Ethereum are American whatsoever. Now, this opportunity of Bitcoin's timely death, if you will, could very easily coincide with Bitcoin crashing out right now. And within a few weeks, we could see Trump coming out and saying, well, for the strategic reserve, we've taken the opportunity and we bought up all of this asset A, B, C, D, and E. And immediately we would see an extreme bullish sentiment. So really, it's in his hands right now. And I expect within the next month or two, because he has branded himself the crypto president, we have midterms coming up. If Bitcoin is under the price that it was when he was elected and nothing else has been done, that doesn't really speak well to re-election, especially when 30 or 40% of Americans are now holding cryptocurrency in some way, shape, or form. He needs a Hail Mary, and he needs something to give confidence in the economy, especially. Crypto is his golden ticket, and he has to use it correctly.
Yeah, it's a fair point. You've mentioned in the past, a nice analogy was this idea that if you own one XRP, you own 1/100th billion of the future world economy. Could you reiterate
Yeah.
that point for the audience? Because I thought it was a great sentiment.
Yeah. So at the end of the day, what makes a global reserve currency is that things can be traded in that currency for other things, right? And we're going from previously barter to now we have currency, and now we're looking at what's called a bridge currency or a world bridge currency, and that is XRP. And if you're trying to bridge different currencies, then you become the de facto global reserve currency because you are the middle individual or currency in this case, which must be used to transact from one asset to another asset. Now, although there is a fixed total supply of XRP, that is, of course, decreasing over time with transaction fees and that kind of thing. But what it essentially comes down to is if you take all of the wealth of the human race that is here on Earth and not on Earth, and you were to divide that into XRP, that is what we're looking at in the future. And people that think XRP or Ripple isn't going to rise up and become the World Bank and that kind of thing, I would say, show me any other company anywhere on Earth, anywhere in cryptocurrency that is even remotely as legitimate as Ripple, with former Treasury secretaries and former SEC commissioners and former White House employees of various administrations and so on and so forth. There isn't. There is nothing even remotely close to Ripple's positioning in the market. So Ripple will achieve this bridge currency status, and that will de facto make it the global reserve. And that means that if you own one XRP, you own 1/100 billionth of all human wealth. And that's where we're headed.
Love it. Big time conviction. And I'd love to hear more about your OverUnity devices and what you've created. It's a topic that's fascinated me for years, and I'm sure a lot of people in the community have heard all the horror stories of technologies that get locked up, paid off, destroyed, people killed.
Yeah, all that.
You're still with us, Patrick, which is great. What have you whipped up?
I'm still here, and part of the way I ensure that is, yes, I have dead drops, but also I've only released 4 or 5 of I think about 7 or 8 of the technologies that I've designed so far, but I have more than 40 different technologies that are well in the design and development and theoretical phases varying. But with the OverUnity device you were alluding to, that was actually the first design that I really wanted to build that got me into cryptocurrency. And that's because when I started building engines and started building cars, when I got back from Iraq and had my head injury, I started to think, well, this is stupid. Why do we need an explosion inside the motor to move the piston? And I started thinking about, well, what are the alternatives? And of course, electromagnetism can, in fact, move things without friction and without an explosion. So essentially what I did is I designed at that time a V8 motor that would use a magnet traveling on the piston through a cylinder, and that cylinder sleeve wrapped in a coil would create a Lorentz force perpendicular to the coil that sends a charge. So instead of sending that charge to an electromagnet that sits on top of the piston where the valve would be, I'm sending it to a different piston, which is essentially the same thing as a firing order in a traditional V8 engine. The design I ended up settling on as I kind of matured this more was actually a radial design. So the radial design is a 8-piston Riley radial that uses 8 different solid state magnets traveling through a copper coil to feed an electromagnet that is a 90-degree turn from that turning piston. And what that essentially does is it makes it so that the Z-axis or the crankshaft is denied rest, and you can attach an alternator to either the bottom or the top of any Riley radial. And if you do an 8 stack with a 45-degree turn in each of those modules, then you would have removed all mechanical resistance within that stack. And I have actually prototyped this, and I've got a work in progress prototype here right behind me.
Wow.
But what this essentially does is produces energy, or produces as a generator through the turning of an alternator. Now, that might sound extremely simple to people because, people think free energy and they think, plasma and ionics and all these really fancy terms of physics. But what I'm doing is actually extremely simple. If you think about it, there is only solar electricity and alternator electricity of all the different types that we are producing today throughout the world. So whether we're talking about nuclear power, nuclear power is really just putting some radioactive rods inside of water. That water heats up, produces steam, and that turns a turbine, which turns an alternator. There's no special sauce in the nuclear part itself that produces electricity. You're just turning an alternator. The same is true of a hydroelectric dam. You're using water to turn a turbine, turn an alternator. The alternator is just a permanent magnet, and it's turning against the eddy currents of a copper coil. And so this is true of every single type of electricity produced today, except for, as I said, solar panels. Now, solar panels, you're using a silicon wafer or a medium basically to get hit by solar rays, which then knocks an electron loose and it goes to the positive or the negative end inside of a wafer. But those wafers never run out of electrons. So if you're not following me, what I'm basically saying here is that we've already been doing free electricity. We just haven't been doing it the right way. But the alternator is already pulling electrons out of the ambient energy of effectively the universe. The solar panel wafers are not turning sunlight into electricity. They are knocking electrons loose inside the wafer, but those electrons are immediately replaced by the ether or the ambient electrons in the universe. We are surrounded by electricity and electrons that are usable in everything. And we've previously been using explosions and burning gas and nuclear power and all these things to turn an alternator. We don't have to do that. We can turn the alternator by simply using a more interesting choreographed piston engine. And that is what my design is.
Interesting. So have you done much research into like the neutrino stuff and harnessing neutrinos into free energy devices? Or are you more OverUnity, still input power, then over OverUnity? Is that come on the radar, or is it even plausible? I've seen some companies claim that they can do it. I don't know whether that's legit or not.
So I don't know about the neutrinos. I know that capturing neutrinos is extremely difficult. It's extremely small. There's literally holes miles under the earth to capture just one neutrino. So I don't take those people very seriously until I see some more data on that about how they would actually be using neutrinos. But with my design, essentially what I'm doing is I'm simply denying rest. I'm refusing a moving body the ability to stop moving, not because it has so much friction or a lack of friction, but because there is always something acting on it, no matter what it's doing.
Yeah, right. And do you have any like working prototypes that you've been testing or that you've rolled out?
I do not have working prototypes to demonstrate yet. I have done some testing. I have done some things that I probably shouldn't disclose, if I'm honest, because, this is one of those games that can get me killed. But as I said, I do have some dead drops that would be rather uncomfortable for quite a few individuals.
Interesting. Awesome. Now, in closing, just to wrap up, fun question, speculative. Crypto total market cap today leading 2.2 trillion. 5 years from now, what do you speculate the total crypto market cap looks like once Bitcoin's probably dead and buried, according to you, and the true assets rise?
Easily between 10 to 30 trillion.
Yeah. Cool. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on, Patrick. It's been a pleasure. I've loved every minute of it. We'll have to do it again sometime. And everyone, I will link Patrick's X account and any other socials he wants me to link will be in the description below.
All right. Thank you, Nathan.
Beautiful.